Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Kira Gould, and I'm really excited to have all of you with us today to talk about Women in Green, a discussion that has been going on for, well, in my life, 10 years, which is kind of amazing. And I think it's actually expanding a lot right now, which is really exciting. We are here today to talk about women in green and diversity and inclusion and what those things mean in sustainability and what they mean really in life for us. And I'm not going to read the learning objectives, because if you read them and signed up, then you know what they are. I'm very excited about the group of people we have to talk today. Unfortunately, one of our special guests is stranded at O'Hare Airport, so I will invoke her to the best of my abilities. But we have a great moderator, Susan Sanazzi, the editor and publisher of Metropolis Magazine, a good friend and dear mentor, and so pleased she's here with us. And Gabrielle Bullock from Perkins & Will, and Liz Ogbo from Studio O will be talking as well. And I'm really excited for you to hear their perspectives on how we're dealing with issues of inclusion and equity in the AEC world and in our whole world right now. During my research for thinking about how, looking back on these 10 years, which I must say was inspired in part by my co-author on the book, Women in Green, Lance Hosey, who's here in the front. You can wave, but it's the bald head right there, just in case you didn't see the wave. I was really inspired by, I happened to be listening to E.O. Wilson in this great documentary called Of Ants and Men, and he was talking about, and he was referring to insects, but also to humans, about how exclusion makes us suffer and inclusion makes us thrive. And of course, you know, thriving is really what the point of sustainable design is about. I mean, we're not here to just barely make it through. I mean, that's not inspiring anyone. That's not what we're here to do. So I wanted to mention that, and then also a quick reference to Jamie Cloud, who is she runs an organization in New York dedicated to education around sustainable education. Diversity makes complex life, including us, possible. It is required. In the context of interdependence, everything we do and everything we don't do makes a difference, and that includes everybody. And I think that's important because that really speaks to how we make up teams, how we think about our work, how we think about our life, how we think about our kids' school, how we think about what we do on our block. It's really everything. So a quick look back to the book. For those of you who may not be familiar, it was published in 2007, but we started the research in 2005. And so many people gave us wonderful time and insight into all of their experiences. The late Gail Lindsay, an architect who we asked to talk to us about working together, she said, "Oh yes, I'll talk to you, but I'm going to talk to you about love." And she did, and it was all about working together, and it was it gave rise to a beautiful chapter, which also included Joanne Todd, who is also here today, and thank you for being here. And Janine Benyus, many of you are familiar with her work as well. She was incredibly generous with her time as well, and we were so lucky to go and spend a week in Costa Rica with her, and really learning to listen to nature in a way that made us reflect back on how we might emulate some of nature's principles in how we function in life. And that was just incredibly powerful. All of that led to us building the book around a bunch of open-ended questions, which at the time, when I look back at it, it seems like, well, that was an easy way to write a book. Just make them do all the talking, and we'll just kind of write it all down and edit it, and it'll be really great. Now, though, it strikes me that what it did do, we opened a conversation and it somehow never ended, and in fact has continued to expand and expand. And so the question now is, are we making progress? I mean, is sustainability, making progress in the world? And are we making progress in sustainable design? And those are questions that, depending on the studies you look at, the results are mixed, shall we say. From the standpoint of women in sustainable design, there has been some progress, but most people, I did a survey this summer of a variety of people that we had talked to during the research for the book, and lots of people that in the ensuing years that we had discussed around these topics. And most people said some progress around gender in this area, and little or no progress around diversity in other areas, real inclusion, and inequity. And that was quite alarming to me, because you really think that, I mean, it's been a decade since we started discussing this. You would think, oh, well, things must have been advancing. Not so much. And as it turns out, that's also true in the bigger picture, and there have been, many of you may be aware of some of these more business-oriented and global discussions that are happening. There's a great book out called Sex and World Peace, which, besides the fact that it's a fabulous title, is based on some fantastic research about how the implications of equity issues and on all kinds of community indicators, health indicators, and everything across the board for men and women in a variety of cultures all around the world. Women Lead the Way is a book that Pioneer's Nina Simons pointed me to, which advocates for what she calls the 30% solution. And that is the idea that there has to be a 30%, at least 30% women. She sees that as a sort of tipping point, because without getting to that place, we're still in that sort of tokenism position, whether it be on a team or a board or whatever. And then there's a great book out called The Athena Doctrine, How Women and the Men Who Think Like Them Will Rule the Future. And they did some massive studies about the kinds of thinking that are going into the ways that we're going to be looking at solutions in the future. There are several others. I don't want to get into too much of the detail, and we may be able to come back to some of this later. Gender intelligence is another one of them. I think that one's been a little bit maligned because it's, again, so like our title seems to solely focus on the gender subject, but in fact, gender intelligence, that idea, when applied in a company, opens the door to an inclusive intelligence, and being able to understand what inclusiveness and equity brings to both the workplace environment and the outcomes of the work, be they design outcomes or other kinds of outcomes. And then, of course, the McKinsey Global Institute and leanin.org have also been doing a lot of studies around this. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Equity by design, AIA San Francisco has been doing some great work on trying to quantify that, what they call the missing 32%. Where are all the women going when there are more of them in architecture schools and so many fewer of them at the top of the architecture path? And I wanted for sure to do a shout out to Heather Nelson and Sophia Dulick's work that they've been doing in the last couple of years. They've done a couple of studies, and they are presenting tomorrow afternoon, I believe it's at 4:30, on how gender and age are impacting the path to carbon neutrality. And I really recommend listening to that. The study that they're looking at, I think, especially as they continue it over time, which we haven't quite had the opportunity to do with our more casual study, is quite interesting. So some of this relates to something that we like to refer to as feminine traits and sensibilities. And these, of course, are things that many men that we all work with, thankfully, have and display. But they are culturally defined, particularly in our culture, but actually worldwide, as being feminine, and in the business world typically, and frequently in government, therefore devalued. And so that's one of the things we really wanted to look at. We talked a lot about that during the research for the book, and it's something I think that persists. It is getting better, but it is still something that I think in many cases, both in business and in the AEC community, is mostly addressed by a tokenism situation. If you have one or two women on the team, they're going to be the ones that take care of that. They'll make sure everybody gets heard, that kind of thing. And that's not quite how these things actually work in practice. And we're going to hear some good examples about that from our following speakers. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, why are we talking about these issues? Why does sustainability require diversity, inclusion, or equity? Are these essential for this activity? And and if so, why? And during the survey that I conducted this summer, I got some very interesting responses on that. As I mentioned, there were a lot of negatives about how we're so stalled on the progress. So I'm going to skip over a little bit of that. But basically, the point is that you can't have outcomes, a design outcome, or any kind of business outcome, actually, that will have long-term meaningful impact if it does not have a complex and diverse input into it, right? I mean, that's, if you think about it from a sort of mathematical point of view, you need to have, well, I just had an interview earlier today. We need the metric to prove it. We need, and I hope Liz actually is going to talk a little bit about this, because we need to be able to prove that what comes out of any process with the bigger stakeholder group, more input, and a greater diversity of understanding and inclusion, and an attention to equity, and not just equality, and she has a great one on that, is better, and it is better value for the client from a bottom line perspective. Because once you do that, then the argument is over. They don't have to believe in the altruistic part of it. All they care about is the value part. And once we do that, then we're there. So as I mentioned on the progress, I was going to read a bunch of the "we have made no progress" part. I don't really think I can do it. I'll come back to it if we have extra time. It's just too depressing. There are some good definitions, though, about what these things mean. And I have misplaced one of my favorite ones. One of the most important things about definitions is making sure that we understand that diversity is not a person in a room. Inclusion is not a person in a room. It's a person in the room not only understanding that they have a voice, but that their voice is valued, and not even just that their voice is valued, but that their voice is valued and the potential of what their voice brings to the topic is valued. And that is how you begin to get to the equity piece. And when I ask people to define equity, that could be actually quite a book of its own, because that opened up a can of, as everyone here is well aware, income inequality in this country is absolutely unbelievable, and it is permeating everything we do. You see it in every project, you see it in every business, and in every industry. So I think it's important, and this is the reason definitions are so important is that it's something about when you bring the team together, talking about what those mean, what they mean to that team, to that project, and to the outcome that is desired. One thing that is very interesting that's happened, I think, in the last 10 years since the book came out is the issue of sort of mainstreaming green. It was already starting to happen in 2005 when we started doing this research, and it has had a variety of effects, positive and negative. I mean, mainstreaming green is great in many ways. There's broader consumer understanding and interest. There's kids educating their parents. That's a great one. There's all kinds of stuff happening like that. But there's a lot of greenwashing. There's a lot of things happening for PR effect. And there are a lot of questions about how best to optimize sort of corporate engagement. So I think that's something that we're going to want to talk about a little bit. I did ask a question in the survey about that, and I have a variety of somewhat, some more pessimistic than others. Susan actually said, see, I have to call you out once in a while, because you get to do it to us the whole time. Susan was suggesting that big companies are making their moves around sustainability in large part for PR benefits, which I think we all know is true, rather than for broad impact. And her belief is that it is empowered individuals using massive social networks that will make the big changes. And I think that's largely true. I think what we need to think about is how to actually merge those two, because if we could find a way to do that, that would be that would double the power. Nancy Clanton mentioned that those large companies really need to take care to talk to the younger talent in their companies and to listen to them and include that talent in their discussions. And one of my favorites, Vivian Lofness of Carnegie Mellon University said that we should cap CEO salaries to 100% of the lowest paid workers, including the part-timers. I like that. That's a good one. So I'm going a little long. There are barriers and there are opportunities. Most of the barriers cited in the survey that I did had to do with money. I think Dana Baumeister of Biomimicry 3.8 put it most succinctly, so I'm going to read her quote. Sadly, money equals access, and that hasn't changed. As long as the dominant value proposition is monetarily based, there will always be inequity. The opportunity lies not in a greater distribution of wealth, that's still tied to the old mental models of money equals value, but rather increasing the value of non-monetary aspects of our lives. And I thought that was really interesting because that's really about shifting perceptions, which is frankly, a much bigger barrier, certainly for the corporate world, but also in our sector as well. And as to opportunities, which are more optimistic, Nina Simons, co-founder of Bioneers, many of you may know her work, and she's been a big influence on me and was very helpful with the book. She has said this on occasion before, but reminded me that we must shift our focus from things to relationships. To truly advance our design thinking, We need to plan for diverse approaches and constituencies, and to do this, we must have diverse designers and leaders at the table from the start. There are several others I would like to quote. I may come back to some of these later. I think many of the young people I heard from in the survey were struck and disturbed, frankly, by the lack of equity as a discussion point at all in their workplace. And those workplaces ranged from, big architecture and engineering firms to much smaller startups. And I thought that was quite interesting and something that we should explore further. A little bit about metrics. Gail Vittori was honored last night with the Hanley Award. She thinks that's what is missing is the defining metrics and tracking outcomes. And this is almost always the case. I mean, as we know, the way to move the needle is to prove the case so that even the non-believers can get on board. And her point was that if we can show that the diversity and inclusion and equity approach is having more positive outcomes, regardless of the metric. So in the case of a company, more profitable outcomes, then we will be able to make that case, and it will no longer be an issue. Then we wouldn't be struggling when you're filling out the RFP, you're looking at your team and you're like, kind of looks like a lot of white guys. All right, do we have anybody we can throw in there? That. I know no one's ever had that experience. But it happens, and it doesn't make a team better to do that. And we know that. So I think our responsibility is to figure out what the metrics are that show the benefit, because then we won't have to do that. We won't have to make it about altruism. We just make it about proof, and we're done. And I cannot leave this slide out. I know I'm running out of time. But leverage points, places to intervene in a system. Many of you may know Dana Meadows' wonderful article. And one part of it I think is so perfect to this topic. Insistence on a single culture shuts down learning, cuts back resilience. Any system, biological, economic, or social, that becomes so encrusted that it cannot self-evolve, a system that systematically scorns experimentation and warps out the raw material of innovation, is doomed over the long term on this highly variable planet. That was a long time, and she was right, still right. So some ideas for what we can do. I think we need a Genius Grant for innovative diversity, inclusion, and equity strategies. It's like, the MacArthur version of that. We have to figure out a way to prove it and show it better. And we need to share those stories. That's not surprising that I would argue for that. I'm a writer. I forgot to introduce myself. Sorry. Hi, I'm a writer. We need to share the stories, and we need to reveal what's working, recalibrate when it doesn't, and then repeat the best pieces. That's the only way we're going to advance it, and then push more in every context. That's all for me for now. We were going to have a special guest who is stuck in O'Hare, unfortunately. But she would say, Diane Dillon Ridgely was going to join us, and she would have reminded us that Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem and many others have been reminding us all along that this is not a gender issue, it is a humanity issue, and it will take all of us. She would say it much more eloquently and longer, but she would have said that, and I'm sorry she's at O'Hare and not with us here now. So that's all I have.
Hello, everyone. So I'm just saying that Bella should be reincarnated every generation. the hat, the manner, the brassiness, the ballsiness, the whole thing should be brought back. Because without that, it's very hard to be soft-spoken and to get some action. But here's something that I would like, and I want to start my questioning with an ambush. I want Lance Hosey to come up here. I need to ask you a question. No, I'm not bashing you. I really want to ask you a question, but this is really important. Come on up, because you're going to have to. So we had, oh boy, he's being so silly. We surveyed the room, and there are a dozen men in this room.
Generous.
And if you're a man.
That's a generous
No,
estimate.
thank you.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming. But it's really interesting because we planned this as a group, and obviously around the book title that it was an anniversary. But Lance, the question that I have for you is that how could we have phrased this better so that, again, because it's all in the words, how could we have phrased this better so that there's a more diverse attendance to something that is absolutely important to every gender and every age and every skill?
Thanks for the softball question, Susan. The way that because Kira and I both have written about this since the book came out, and when I write about this now, I tend to refer to it as being about the links between diversity and innovation. I don't think sustainability really takes hold until we make more progress around innovation, and there's emerging research, reams of literature that shows that more diversity leads to greater innovation. So, and diversity comes in many ways. Who was it that said to me this morning that they started referring to gender diversity as endocrine diversity? And I thought, that might be a good way to look at it. So I think it's really more about diversity and less about gender per se. Good answer? May I sit down now?
No, not quite, because, I mean, is the word, no, I hate to say this because this is such a loaded thing, and it's been a loaded thing for me too for many years. The minute you bring up women, it sort of segregates us. So would you have kind of recast the title?
Why is she asking me these questions?
Because, we discussed it. We discussed, should we leave women in the green be in the title of the session, and will we still end up with only 12 men in the audience?
Well, let's ask the men. Do you think more men would have shown up if it had been diversity and green?
Yep, someone over there. Someone over there wants
to say
something.
Did all the men leave? Over here.
Did we alienate you already?
Go ahead.
Here's one. Actually, would all the men come up?
So my name is Sean Hesse, and I've been doing a lot of work around issues with equity. I'm on the Social Equity Working Group with Joel and Lance. And, so one of the things that for me stands out is our choice of words really does matter. And as soon as you say equity, it instantly means something, and it's probably something different to everyone. Diversity, right? It has a lot of connotations. And so the word that I like to use is just difference, because it doesn't trigger anybody, right? And nobody's going to argue that having people with different perspectives is a bad thing, right? Especially in a creative field. And thinking about things as difference rather than diversity, or putting labels in equity, and trying to strip away any word that could possibly trigger people.
Good luck.
Well, but I think that's what we're talking about, right? Is like, why is it that only 12 men show up to a session that's titled "Women in Green"? Well, that's not for me, right? Well, that happens for. You pick a subject and you put a label on it, and some group of people thinks, well, that's not for me. So I think difference.
I think you really pointed up something really important here, is that we are at the stage of our evolution where the words that were invented to describe all the things that we did in the 20th century in an industrialized world are so incredibly uncomfortable in the 21st century with all this access to a lot more information and broader connections and a very different way of doing things and a very different way of connecting, like the social networks overcoming some of the corporate biases and figuring out how all of that kind of works together and how the words work for us now. I think that's a huge part of 21st century thinking. And it's not a neutral thing, what you call it. And I think that that's something that we all need to kind of figure out how to do and how to integrate. Lance, would you like to add something else while you're here?
Actually, for somebody who's begging to sit down, I have one more thing to say. Is that surprising to anyone here?
Not
so
in the least.
actually, I think something you said when you first opened your mouth was that we need more brassiness and more. I actually think, remind me your name again? Sean? So with all due respect to Sean, I actually think that we need more rabble-rousing and less sort of evening out. And in fact, one of the things that Gail Lindsay told us is that she did a lot of work with the military, and she would go into this room where she was about this tall and just like a light bulb. And she'd go into this room full of men in uniform, and the fact that she was so different from everybody in the room gave her a kind of power that no one else in the room had. So I actually think that difference is a great word, but if we try to assimilate and not really hold on to the edginess of the difference, then we lose the power of that. Now I'm going to sit down.
Susan,
That was very good, Lance.
Susan, can I add on to that? Just to sort of say, I think connected to that is that part of the reason why we're dealing with so many of the issues that we're dealing with today is that everybody's afraid of being uncomfortable. Like, it is so much easier to go to a space that's like where we're not, rocking the boat whatsoever. And I think in that context, then we're never able to actually address or solve anything. And so actually trying to figure out how do we deal with people being uncomfortable and using these complicated words and actually trying to figure out how to get past that is super important if we're going to talk about how do we move forward to get to a vision that we're all saying that we want to see.
And if we can all get comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because that's what it's going to take.
See, you just gave your presentation.
That's great.
They're fantastic.
Sit down now.
It is a perfect segue, too, because so Gabrielle Bullock from Perkins & Will will be our next speaker. And I think this is, part of what we are talking about, it is actually a different language. We're learning to speak a different language. You can look at that in a number of different ways. Some of it has to do with how we build teams. Some of it has to do with how we process our own comfort factors and other things. But I think Gabrielle will give us some insight into how that's working at a large firm. She is a principal and the firm's director of global diversity at Perkins & Will. And I will let you give the rest of your detailed biography, so I will not speak to your passions. Thank you.
Hope I don't fall off the stool, drop my papers.
And you would like the clicker.
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Especially the men. Where are you again?
Will all the men stand up so we can clap? Thank you for coming.
See, stools were designed for men to belly up to the bar.
Yeah.
And so
That's why I'm wearing pants.
That's a good
Exactly.
idea.
So you,
Great idea. Next
they're
time
not.
we'll offer food and beverages for men.
Okay.
Excellent plan.
Sorry, Gabrielle.
Yeah. So good afternoon. My name is Gabrielle Bullock. I'm an architect. And I'm going to start out by telling you why I'm here and why I care. So I'm one of 326 black female licensed architects in this country. That's 0.3%. Wow. That's uncomfortable. I'm often the only one in the room. I'm glad to see there are others here. I'm glad to see there's a room full of women. So I have a personal passion and mission to make not only Perkins & Will more diverse across all areas of diversity and differences, but the profession as well. I love my profession. I think we do important work for the world, and I think we should represent and mirror the communities that we serve. So I'm going to start sort of at the end and read you Perkins and Will's mission, and that should set the stage, and then I'll share with you how we got there, what we're doing, and how we're poised for a cultural shift. So we believe that inclusion spurs creativity and that innovation is born from an engaged culture of diverse people and ideas. In this global environment, we are committed to building an organization that reflects the diversity of the communities and clients we serve. So why are we doing this? Well, actually, let me tell you when we did this. So in 2013, I had the opportunity to redefine my role, my day-to-day role at the firm. And so I thought about it, and I came back to my CEO, and I said, you know what? It's time for us to focus on diversity. For those of you who may not know, Perkins & Will is a purpose-driven firm. All of the work we do is tied to sustainability, social responsibility, design excellence, and all of those initiatives that are now part of our DNA were started and championed by individuals. So an individual decided that the firm ought to be more sustainable, should focus on design excellence, should be part of the 1% and do more social responsibility. So I likened diversity and inclusion and engagement, I'll add a third word that we can define later, equally important and valuable as all three of those. So it wasn't a stretch for me to propose this focus and me being the leader. It was accepted by the board and CEO immediately. So full buy-in, that's important, number one. So why are we doing this? So we're a global firm. We do work all over the world. Our clients are diverse. We realize that our teams were not necessarily equipped to deal with the diversity of the clients and communities that we're serving. The demographics of this world is changing, particularly in this country. In the not too distant future, the minority, ethnic, racial diversity in this country will turn it upside down. There will be more ethnically diverse than white. So things are changing. And if we want to be relevant and if we care about our work impacting the environment, people, and culture, we ought to change with it. So the other thing is our clients are demanding it. Our clients frequently want to know, what are we doing about being more inclusive, being diverse? And some of them are talking about quotas, and some of them are talking about programs, and really, the nuts and bolts of how do you create a diverse culture in the organization. Our clients, the communities that we serve are diverse. We do all kinds of work, schools, hospitals, laboratories, urban design. So we touch almost every community type, as I'm sure many of you do. So how can we do that successfully and meaningfully if we don't either understand, can't represent, and don't ask? The third, fourth, very important focus is the pipeline. So while there are 44%, I think Kira mentioned this, while there are 44% of women going into the schools, at some point 32% are dropping out. So more and more women will be going into architecture. So how can we make sure that they stay? Another interesting, so in the AIA associate members, so that's the future, right? Women will be twice as many as there are now as AIA members. So there'll be 30%, and I'm just using AIA as a measure because that's who publishes their stats. But just as an example, the number of women will double. The number of African Americans will double, if you can believe, will triple if you can believe that. Right now it's 1%. It'll be 3% if the associate members continue into the profession. Hispanics, as an example, will also double from 3% to 6%. So just some facts to show that the demographics are changing, the profession is changing, and it's good news in my mind because we're growing and we're changing. So, and then the other thing is a educational outreach to the K-12, to middle school and elementary school, to bring awareness to architecture and design in the profession. In many underrepresented communities, little children do not know what an architect is, they never met one, and so to help build the pipeline, particularly across racial lines, that is a focus of ours as well. So all of these are reasons why Perkins & Will is focusing on diversity, inclusion, and engagement. And I am the change agent. And frequently, it takes a change agent to be bold enough to create, prepare, lead, and drive change. So back to definitions. I'm going to make my definitions really simple. So as I said, we not only are we focusing on inclusion, which is the differences, all the unique characteristics that make us unique, and inclusion, which is what are you going to do with them? Because diversity alone is checking a box. Same way a lead checklist is checking a box. It is not holistic. So what do you do after you've created a diverse environment? You have to include people. You have to include their ideas. You have to engage them, and you have to keep them engaged. And so there's two analogies. So diversity is the mix. Inclusion is what do you do with the mix? And my most favorite is I happened to hear Donna Brazil speak a couple of months ago, and she said diversity is asking someone to the party, and inclusion is asking them to dance. Mm-hmm. I love that. Third time I've quoted her. She's probably going to call me for some royalties or something. Okay. So I'll talk to you a little bit about how we started this and what the goals were. I think I mentioned most of the goals. So I started with research. As I said, I'm an architect. I'm not a diversity practitioner, and believe me, there are plenty of them out there. I met a whole bunch last week. But it's a career for many. So I didn't really know what I was going to find, but I know I had to do some research both in the practice of diversity and inclusion and a deep dive into the firm. So the deep dive into the firm, we have 27 offices, both US and globally, and I did listening tours. I went to each office and spent a couple of hours with a representative group, age, race, gender, sexuality, you name it, and had a very open, honest, and sensitive and difficult conversation. Limited the number of principals and leaders that were in the room so that the teams could be open and honest. It was like somebody turned on a faucet. These kids, I say kids, not really kids, oh my God, strike that. People were just itching to talk about the issues and challenges that they were having from almost every perspective. Some of the more common themes were dearth of women leaders, the work-life balance / integration, because I'm not sure there is any balance, racial diversity, and a whole host of things. So from the listening tours, I had an idea of what areas of focus we need to pay attention to, that where were the real challenges. And it varied from region to region, office to office. Then we decided that there needed to be some training for our leaders, some cultural awareness, some gender intelligence training, implicit bias training. People weren't talking about diversity and inclusion. They weren't talking about why they weren't, moving up. They just guessed and wondered. And so this gave everybody an opportunity to have that uncomfortable conversation. From the training, we had each office develop their own diversity and inclusion strategic plan, which not only quantified, it was not only quantitative, it was qualitative, and mostly qualitative. So I'm going to back up 1 second. From the research and from the listening tours, I had a baseline of where we stood by the numbers and by cultural issues. So 2 years from now, or on a yearly basis, we'll be able to measure back how far we've come. Have we done the programs we said we're going to do? Have we addressed the leadership advancement issues that reared their head, things like that. So that gave us a baseline. We had a plan moving forward. Each office had a strategic plan. And then, so this is just an outline. And one of the other things that I'm doing is I'm sharing this information with anybody who wants it. So some of these diagrams were done for other colleagues in other firms, engineers, who want to do something similar in their organization. So this is just a graphic representation of what the process is. But the point is that it's a journey. It's not a sprint, and it's not going to happen overnight. And the goal is to have it be a process and not an event. This is just not something we're doing in 2015 or 2013. Hopefully, the goal will be that it'll be in our DNA, the same way sustainability is and good design. Let's see if I missed anything there. Okay. This is just the header of our progress tracker. So from the strategic plans from each office, each category is listed in this report card, so to speak, and each office gets to fill it out every year. And it will be part of the performance evaluation of that office. So nobody gets a pass. And I don't mean to sound so dogmatic about it, but it really is a process, and it really is everybody's responsibility to make this work if we want to make a change, and everybody's agreed that we want to make a change. So that's what we get. What else? So we believe that diversity drives innovation, as does inclusion. So this summer, we engaged the entire firm, 1,700 people, in a diversity design challenge. And we sought a unique graphic representation of what diversity and inclusion meant to the people in our firm. These are the top 5 winners, and they are used in all of our marketing, recruitment, presentations like this. So it was a real good start at building a culture of diversity and innovation. And we got 60 or 70 responses, and they're all pretty fabulous. Okay. So it really is a call to action. And if we're loud, we're trying to be loud. I speak a lot. I talk to a lot of groups. I share what we do. We have a diversity council, by the way. So we're vocal. We're visibly committed. We're driven. We're focused on the mission. Everybody is engaged. Everybody is committed. And we're very clear. There is no ambiguity. Nobody gets a pass. We're clear about the expectations. We allow everybody to help create the goals and the path forward so that everybody is on board. So if we are loud, driven, and clear, we will be leaders and loud voices within this discussion, which is taking on life of its own, which is great. It's particularly this year, I think this conversation has been consistent, and I think it'll keep going on. We'll be a more powerful organization. Research shows that if you are more diverse, you will be more successful, you'll be more creative. And we'll build a stronger pipeline if we're successful in doing our education outreach to build the future of the profession. And we'll be successful in creating that cultural shift that we think is so important to have a more balanced and ultimately more innovative organization. And this is the comparative slide. So I said, okay, how am I going to tie all this to sustainability? And after thinking about it all, it really is, it's about the future. It's not about the past, it's about the future. There's a sense of urgency similar to sustainability. I think our profession will suffer if we don't think of it as a sense of urgency. The impact on design, I think better design comes from more voices at the table. It's mainstream. It needs to be mainstream if it's going to be lasting and sustainable, and it's beyond a checklist. And it will require a holistic approach. You know, we are addressing diversity and inclusion across all platforms of our organization, not just HR, not just marketing, but business development, our team structures, across the board. And it takes advocacy of the people in this room, all of you. It takes us all to make a change. Because I'm not going to be the diversity lady. So, and it's deliberate. If it's not deliberate, if it's not purposeful, it's not going to happen. Thank you.
So, okay, so Gabrielle, I have a couple of questions. Out of the 1,700 people in the firm that you actually had contact with during this process, I want to hear about body language, because, you know, when people do this, they really don't want anything in. How much of those crossed-arm sessions did you go through before you got everybody convinced that this was important?
I think everybody, well, let's take each session at a time,
okay.
Right? So each session was a couple hours, about half a day. And so if I'm in Boston, for instance, at the Boston office, it didn't take long for everybody to realize that everybody was uncomfortable. What took, and the body language was there. There were gender issues. There were, and I don't want to call out, okay, so I'm not talking about Boston. So there are, oh man, this is taped, huh? Oh boy. There's gender behavior that became very evident. We've had follow-up conversations like immediately after the session. So it's not so much the body language, it's maybe in the eyes.
Yeah.
You know, and what was fascinating and what I really wanted was for everybody in that particular room to be curious about the next person's perspective. So I had each person introduce themselves and ask and talk about anything related to diversity and inclusion that they wanted to, whether it was at work or at home or whatever. So there were some pretty honest and sensitive topics that came out. And so a colleague would say, wow, that really does happen. And that's what we want. We want the conversation to happen.
So this was presented to them, to all the offices as a process, not as something that's going to happen now, because I think people are threatened by quick decisions and you know, what do I do with this now?
Right.
So
no, it was purposely and it was truly a listening tour. I listened a lot. I couldn't even pretend to figure out how to attack this elephant without listening first and getting everybody's input.
So in this case, I mean, among the 1,700, did you say 1,700 people, there's got to be some really interesting lessons to be learned for everyone here and for you. I mean, what are some of those bottlenecks that just keep happening over and over again so that you're constantly having to revisit some of the issues that just won't go away?
I think constantly we struggle with how much communication is enough communication around this issue, because we don't want people to roll their eyes, oh, here she goes again. But if you're not consistent with the message and with the expectations, then people will stop paying attention to it. We had the same issue around sustainability. We had the same issue around design excellence. So until there were measurements and progress check-ins and critiques in the case of design, it was not taken as seriously as we intended. But ultimately, with all of that, it will be taken seriously and it will become part of our DNA.
And the firm has the history of going through some very difficult conversions. I mean, sustainability, the precautionary list, all of those things that you guys were championing early on, before even the USGBC thought about this. So, I mean, I just think that there was a lot there to build on, but even so, it probably wasn't enough because it was a whole different issue. It was much less, it seemed much more personal and much less professional in a way.
Exactly. And because it's my personal passion, I mean, if you're able to marry your personal passion with your professional goals, that's great. And at this stage in my career, I can do that. But that is a very sensitive subject. So when I laugh and I say I don't want to be the diversity lady, it's because I don't want people to assume that it's just my personal mission. This is the firm's mission. But someone had to stand up and say, this is what we need to be focusing on because here are the issues.
And then
that is a challenge.
Right, and then the firm needed to make that commitment. So you're taking people away from that billable hour mindset. And so it's really hard. Everybody complains about not being able to do that. So there's time set aside that is sanctioned from the people who are in charge of the firm is really key to all of this.
It is a funded initiative. I spend, hate that word, I spend 40 to 45% of my time leading this and driving it. The council has set us a council of 10 to 12 people who are assigned different regions so that I don't have to do it all, and there's fingers all the way out there, so their time is accommodated. And the rest of what the rest of the 1,700 people need to do is what you would do in a normal culture of an office. Have you celebrated the differences in your office this month, last month, at all? Do you know the person sitting next to you? Have you done the research on that project you're doing in Saudi Arabia? So those sorts of things don't need to be funded. I think setting up, and which is what we're starting to do now, is setting up affinity groups so that there are communities, if one would like to be a part of one, around a certain category, if you will.
I have a question about that, though. One thing I think is so interesting is that you were saying, it's like an initiative, right? Like sustainability is an initiative, design excellence is an initiative. And so at a certain point for certain firms, those initiatives become integrated, and then they are part of the DNA of the firm. That's the goal, right?
Yes. And at Perkins & Will, sustainability is part of our DNA. We don't necessarily have an initiative any longer. Design, we don't have an initiative around design. We do design. Our social responsibility program, we set aside 1% of all billable hours, so it's still maybe an initiative, but there's a bucket and there's a charge to everybody. And if you don't use that bucket by the end of the year, by the way, you're questioned. So why didn't you surely there's a project out there that needs us.
Well, what I think is so interesting about that, I mean, I'd like to give that like props, because I think that's actually like putting it at that level and saying, so, if you come to interview with this firm and that is not something that is important to you and that you think you want to contribute to, and that, then that's not the right firm for you. I mean, it should be understood as a part. I mean, you started with the mission, and I get that, and obviously it's hard to force it in and make it part of the culture. But I do think it's interesting to compare it to, because so many firms have gone through the process of trying to make sustainability, integrating that into their mission, and that's even when they say, because there's a lot of lip service around that. Everybody did it.
So I have to go back to it takes personal champion and an expert and someone, and we have several of those around sustainability, but it started really with one who really drove it and drove it hard. But people didn't mind that because it was the next thing, right? Driving something like diversity and inclusion, first you have to explain to people what it is, and you have to figure out together what it means to be more diverse and more inclusive, and how is that going to benefit the practice.
So does the fact that your clients are all over the world and are kind of all kinds of races and cultures and very distinct people who have a lot to bring to the global discourse on humanity and environment and the built environment, does that help matters a little bit in integrating this?
I think it does help, because when we're having these discussions firm-wide, globally, we're looking at things through the diversity lens. So you can't help but bring that back to the work that you're doing and the clients you're doing it for. And particularly when you're working in, I keep mentioning Saudi Arabia, we do a lot of work in Saudi Arabia. And if there's ever a culture that's very different than what we're used to, and requires a lot of understanding and cultural competency. So say yes. And so we try to equip our teams with the necessary skills, understanding, sensitivities to be able to work anywhere in the world respectfully.
So one last question in this sequence, because I want to kind of go to your wider audience, and you mentioned K through 12 and how we kind of begin to integrate with them. And so K through 12 is fascinating these days because these are the creatures of the 21st century, mobile, digital society that get truly global in their information, but get very local in their making things and connecting to community and connecting to each other. And, STEM and STEAM learning is changing the way of the world. So how is the firm beginning to kind of reach out with your knowledge to the schools to kind of teach them about architecture and built environment and building? Because I think one of the issues that I see is an informed citizenry really making better decisions about their environment, and you need to start the kids in kindergarten to know that this is an important thing. So what sort of responsibility do you have there?
So we already, and even before we focused specifically on diversity, we were involved with the ACE program, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. It's architecture, engineering, and construction, and you spend a semester or so with a senior in high school. And that's worked fine, but that's too late. Many of them don't go on to architecture. So our idea, and we're doing it grassroots in certain offices. They've been doing it for years, going into elementary schools and middle schools and having work sessions or bringing the kids to the office and showing them around for a day. What we'd like to do is have a program where it's the same program. I mean, we have 24 offices in this country. We could reach a lot of middle schools and elementary schools and have a focused effort around those kinds of schools and develop a program so that we're not reinventing the wheel, because once you have to reinvent the wheel, then I don't have time to do that. I got projects. So the more systematic approach that we can provide our offices to do the outreach, the more it'll be used. And it'll be more consistent.
That topic came up in the survey so much. So, around the equity subject, so many people said, we will never get the socioeconomic gap covered if we are not, those people never meet architects. Those kids at those schools are not meeting architects. I mean, that came up multiple times. It was a little out of my area, but it's a huge topic, and it's everywhere, and you can see it. They don't know them. They don't know what that is.
Well, one of the amazing things about architecture and design in general is that I'm like a perfect specimen for this. You get caught and you can't let go. I'm not an architect. I'm not a designer. I'm just one of those weirdo creatures that kind of hovers around everything. So
should I go back a slide to the butterflies?
But I think it's really important because there's something so incredibly attractive about making things, designing things, thinking things through, showing how it's done, making models, making something that is of the real world, and that is incredibly appealing, and architecture certainly isn't shown like that. So when you get this learning unit in kindergarten through 12th grade, and they are using 3D printers, they are using models, they are drawing, they are telling stories historically about buildings, they are talking about their neighborhoods. So it's a natural environment for architecture to be introduced to, and not to be introduced to, but to be used as a lesson. And I think that sort of hasn't happened before. This is a rich area to kind of include a lot more kids and a lot more gender and a cultural and racial diversity into the discourse.
It's also important because it's not just about whether or not those people go on to become architects, but it's about giving them the language to be able to participate in these conversations, which is about power. And so if they have never been exposed to it, then they will never have any power to shape their environment. So they'll have very little power. And so this is also about equalizing it so that more people can actually speak up in these spaces.
Well said.
Totally.
You're up next.
Thank you.
Let me do a quick introduction.
Go ahead.
So just quickly, I just want to briefly introduce Liz Ogbu, who is designer and social innovation strategist, and she's going to talk about how designers work to solve wicked social problems through creative transformations of places, systems, and communities. She's founder and principal of Studio O, and I will let you tell the rest.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to stand because I've already had visions of flying off this chair, and I want to spare all of us that. Studio O is a design consultancy focused on social impact design. I work with communities all over the world trying to figure out ways to use not just architecture, but all types of design to try and make deep social change. And I guess we're all kind of describing why we're here or why we're part of this. And I think for me, it's both personal and professional. My mentor commented to me a couple of months ago that I'm a tall black woman. So there will never be a room that I can enter that those two things are not going to be apparent. And a lot of times I go into rooms and I'm the only one, right? And that's an interesting thing that we can go into a whole story about at some point. But in thinking about issues of diversity, inclusion, engagement, that's part of the identity that I need to wrestle with, just being out in the world, whether it's a professional or a personal circle. So for me, the more that we can talk about it, it's not just about for me, but for the others who are in the room with me and learning how to move forward. And I think for a lot of the communities that I work with, that this is an important issue for them as well. Because a lot of times they have been ostracized or kept out of mainstream environments. And for them, it's also something that they're contending with every second of their lives. And so if we don't talk about these kinds of things, we can't actually improve situations for them as well. So that's kind of like my entry point into this work. And I think in particular, when it comes to sustainability, I haven't used sustainability as a term very often. I think more about sustainable communities, because I think some of the challenge with sustainability is that we've dropped the people part of it, and talking about communities and making them sustainable can be a way to bring the people back into it. And so I often show this kind of slide sequence to sort of illustrate the importance of this. So the Brundtland report is kind of one of the major things that came out that really helped define sustainability as we know it. And it talked about this idea of meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And what's interesting is I've looked at many dictionary definitions of sustainability, and they often go straight to the planet-saving exercise. That it's about green, it's about nature. And nowhere in this definition of sustainability is there any mention of that. It's about how do we ensure a better future while also ensuring a better present. And so I think a great illustration of what happens when we steer more on the kind of nature and green side of the fence is this. It's an abandoned library in Camden, New Jersey. And if sustainability is about nature, then this is amazing. We have done our job and we can all go home. But I don't think many of us would say that this is an example of what we want to create, right? Where are the people? What has happened in this community that's created this type of situation? And so, to quote the illustrious Lance, does sustaining life mean just maintaining a pulse, or does it also mean embracing all the things that make it worth living? And so for me, that's the question that we need to address, and that's the thing that we need to think about, and that's where people begin to come into the equation again. And so I also believe that it starts to then be about this issue of equity. So I do many things. I'm part of many groups, and one of the groups that I've recently become a part of is a group of, not coincidentally women, 8 women, called the Equity Collective. And we're all involved in community-based design in particular, and we began trying to figure out how do we, when we looked around at both the people who were in our sector, working in our sector, we saw that there was very little diversity, very little people of color, a lot of committed people, but we didn't look like the communities that we were trying to serve. And when we went into the communities that we were trying to serve, we also saw instances of people not really valuing the voices of those communities, kind of coming in as the heroic expert designer and fixing the communities. And so we wanted to figure out how could we do things a little bit differently. And so we actually worked with a diversity trainer. As part of a larger group, we brought in a group called Race Forward that does diversity training. And one of the things that came out of that is that the word diversity was holding us back a little bit. Because diversity was actually about representation, to the point that you said. And to use another analogy, it's the pie, and it's basically saying you have one of each color slice of the pie, and then we're good. But just like showing the illustration or the photo of the tree kind of shows that actually doesn't feel right. I think looking at a pie where it's like Rainbow Nation, but actually doesn't really address the differences and the inequities that are there is similarly hollow. So equity is about fairness, and if you've read this definition, that's great. But it's also, it's about fairness of not just opportunity, but also outcomes. That at the end of the day, what we want to see is that everyone is at the same place, which means that the pie may not be able to be equally cut in order to be fair, because we're starting off at different places. So this is sort of a famous illustration about that. 3 lovely boys trying to watch a baseball game. You can see some are height challenged, if you want to use a politically correct term. What you see on the right is an example of equality, which is the word that we often use in these kinds of situations. And so equality is about fairness of opportunities. We've given each of those kids a box with the hope that hopefully they'll all be able to see out over the fence. You can see the poor shrimp on the right is really struggling. And what is on the left is equity. It's this idea that we're actually looking at the situation and we're actually being really intelligent about it and accepting that, hey, the guy on the right is actually going to need a little bit more of a lift to get to the fairness of outcome part, and that you need to apply your resources in that way. And so it may seem weird in design to start to think about what does equity mean, but I think we can't really get to the future that we visualize without actually starting to think about some of these things. And not just think about equity, but to the whole conversation we had a while ago about what are these words, to think about complicated words like power and privilege, and bringing them into the equation and really trying to understand what they mean, whether we bring out definitions or we look at graphics such as this that actually illustrate the point. So I wanted to talk through some of the things that we've come up both as part of the group in terms of thinking about how do we then put this into practice, but then also kind of related to some of the things that I've looked at for my own practice. So one of the things that I think is really important when it comes to equity is this idea of engagement. And engagement's one of those things that can sometimes have a really bad connotation. It's totally token. Oh yeah, we went and had a community meeting, we can check that box. And I like to think of engagement more in terms of thinking about what is the quality of engagement that we have. And this is, the terms expert citizen and citizen expert is something that came out of this great book called Spatial Agency, which if you haven't read it yet, I totally suggest it. The introduction is excellent. And expert citizen is probably representative of many of us who are in this room, that we've all been trained in a particular type of expertise. And I think a lot of times we think of expertise as very objective, very scientific. We've removed the human element. And the problem is we're all human beings at the end of the day. If anyone is not, feel free to say so now, but I'm going to say that's probably a reasonable assumption on my part. And being human beings, we all have assumptions. When we go into any particular room, we're already assuming conditions that exist there. And acknowledging those assumptions is really important because I think when we don't acknowledge them, that often leads into us doing more harm than good. I also think this idea of citizen, which speaks to our humanity, is about the fact that we need to present our humanity when we go into these places. People don't bond with a robot. They don't trust a robot. But they can trust other people. And so the pairing of the two things for me gives me that additional imperative of how I need to present myself when I go into these situations. And then citizen expert is basically a lot of the people that I work with. They are living in the communities. They will know more about what it's like to live, work, play in these communities than I will ever know. But rarely have they been empowered to think of that knowledge as expertise. And so the only way you're going to create great projects is through mutual learning of that expertise. And so part of the impetus that is on us is to try and create space that feels safe so that expertise can be shared on both sides of the table. And that leads to the lovely idea of co-power. So I think we all know the term empower, but I actually find that sometimes empower has to do with somebody has more power and then is, through the gracious of their heart, giving that power over, and that somebody's losing something in the equation. And I think co-power is about getting to the point where we can all have power together, and that it's about that shared power that's actually going to get us to the end. So the graphic that you see is part of, so the Equity Collective, we did a number of things over this past year to try and not only talk about these issues amongst ourselves, but try and provide tools out there in the world where other people could use it. And so we produced a series of articles that were published in Impact Design Hub this spring under the Design for Equity series. You can also find it on designforequity.org. And then now we've just been working with the Center for Urban Pedagogy, and what's going to come out in January is an illustrated series that's modeled off of the old Goofus and Gallant cartoons. Instead, it's called Dick and Rick, and we say the subtitle is How Not to Be a Dick. It's a lot of fun that can come out of this. But what you see is one part of that sequence where we talk about this idea of going into the community and talking to the community. And Dick, who, of course, is what you don't want to do, is giving them a choice between a red ladder and a blue ladder. That's power. Rick, on the other hand, is actually recognizing that there's a lot of complexity in the situation that he's entering. There's a lot of different perspectives. And part of the allowing power to be shared is allowing those perspectives to be shared and trying to find a way that they can all come together to support what they get at the end. But it's actually putting a sort of intelligent spin onto it and not dumbing it down and not assuming that the people that you're working with would never know enough, and so therefore what you should do is limit their power in order to get at what he, as the architect, wants to create. Equity in practice is also about this idea of ethics and responsibility. So one of the projects that I'm working on right now is a reclamation of an old power plant site, and we're turning it into a community hub. And it's in a very poor neighborhood within San Francisco, historically African-American. And one of the things that became critically important to us was not just to say, hey, this is 30 acres of land and we have a brilliant idea of what could be put here, nor was it to say, let's have a community meeting and either show drawings and diagrams and whoever comes can weigh in and that's our community process. But that really our responsibility to create a great project that would really support the community was to really find ways to invest in the community as part of the process. So what you see on the left is we've kind of taken advantage of this project to do some tactical urbanism. So we've been activating the site as a part of our process of figuring out the design. And so what you see on the left is members, local youth in the community. That out of many of the early conversations that we heard, a lot of people, regardless of constituency, said, you have to do something for the youth. They are the future of the community. And so we brought them in to participate in shaping the site. But we didn't just say, hey, come, we have a cool opportunity for you. We actually hired them. Because the ethical thing to do would be not to say, well, just by virtue of being able to give your participation, that's what you should be happy about. It's to say, no, we can actually give you a job. We can pay you to be part of this process and have an actual exchange for the information that you're going to give us to help us create something. We've also completely kind of blown apart the idea of community meetings, and so our meetings are basically events. And the idea is that we're providing something of benefit so that when you come and give us our ideas, you're not going away empty-handed with just the feeling of joy that you contributed to this project. And so one of the things that we've done that's been super successful is we hosted a circus, much to the heart attack of my client. First year we did it, we got 650 people, which is unheard of in this community, and probably in San Francisco, it's very hard to get any event that would do that. This year we did it, and we had 1,300 people. And at all of these events, we have stations that are actually getting input from people, but actually what you hear from people is the pure joy of being able to go to something like this in their neighborhood and be able to bring their family. And so for them, they actually feel like they're giving something that having a dialogue with us is like, cool, yeah, sure, I can totally do that. And so for us, it's about fulfilling that responsibility of what does it mean to be practicing within this community. The final thing is also this idea of output versus outcome. So being trained as an architect, we're used to doing buildings or products sometimes comes up in the scale of my work. And then that ends up being the thing that we say, well, we put this in this community, so therefore that's enough. That's great, that's going to transform the community, and it's rarely just about that. And so to think about equity means, equality in the fairness of opportunity is saying, hey, we gave everybody an equal box, we can check our own box and say, hey, we're good, we've accomplished what we want, but that's really the output space. To talk about outcomes and say that you want to see a reality where everybody gets to do what they want to do is to take it to another level. And in architecture, that means that the success story is Rick's success story, where he has people actually actively using the park and wanting to think about what they can do and being co-powered to this better future, to what we were just talking about in terms of they now have a language where they can talk about design and talk about shaping their environments. Whereas Dick, I don't know if you can see it, but he's actually holding a copy of Fame magazine. So his project is published. It's great. It's beautiful. But I would say that it's a little problematic that there's no one using the park. And so I think these are the things I sort of think about when we're talking about equity and talking about what is that next, the next level that we're trying to achieve when we do these kinds of projects. Also along the vein, this is actually something that's being produced by enterprise community partners along with ISA and Health by Design, which is actually a tool to say when you start to do these projects, how can you start to think about this larger lens of things and use that to feed into your design process to get at some of the realities that I think we all want to see. And so to return back to that initial definition and what does it mean, I think it's about taking this broader context of stuff that we look at not only as inputs in the process, but the things that we want to touch as part of the work that we do. And for me, what's been really interesting, I've been on a lot of panels and sitting in a lot of conversations in the past year, couple of years, as we've started to have, any time you pick up the newspaper, you hear about Black Lives Matter, you hear Trayvon Martin, Walter Scott, Sandra Bland, the list unfortunately goes on and on and on. And I think that there's been this question, especially you saw this in Baltimore. I gave an interview to somebody from Al Jazeera America who's like, what does design have to do with all of this? And it was like, well, I can give you a history of Baltimore, which would show how we've kind of created some of these situations. And I think just as some of the work of our predecessors led to some of these environments, it's incumbent on us to actually try and do the work to fix those environments. But we can't do it if we're just thinking about design within this limited scope. It's about thinking about this broader context. And not only thinking about the broader context, but also approaching it not like we're trying to analyze a problem, but that we're actually trying to engage human relationships and bringing it back to that level. So thank you.
Great. So, first I'd like to ask, give us one example of a project that you're working on or you worked on that used this idea of people making their own decisions and part of the co-design process so that it is not thrown away, it's respected, it has a life, it has an evolution. It's really important for us to think about that because without that, sustainability has no meaning. We're kind of, touching the edges if we don't include the users and don't include the love of the place by the users. Can you draw a little profile maybe of one of the projects that you worked on?
So yeah, I can expand on the San Francisco project. So part of what's happened is that through the dialogues that we use these events, which brings out so much more people than we could ever get if we just did a meeting in the community hall. And part of what we do at those events is what I call inclusion activities. So there are different things that are designed. It's everything from being able to write on a card what you think the community needs or what you would love a place to do, to like postering entire aerial with Post-its of the things that you actually want to see in the community, to we did a partnership with StoryCorps and actually built a listening booth where we actually allowed StoryCorps to come in and do recordings. And all the audio from that actually, even though we never said, say what you want to see here, as people reminisced about the things that were special to them about growing up in the neighborhood or living in the neighborhood or the things that they wanted to see, all that was amazing bits of data for like how they wanted to see the future of their community, and if we extrapolated how they wanted to see the future of the site. And so the cool thing about the testing through activation has been that it hasn't just been a community engagement tool. What we've been doing is, as we get all of these bits of information and contribution from people in the community, then we actually figure out what are ways we could turn that into events. How could we take some of that stuff and actually make it happen now and bring people back for that, and through the interaction and having them actually say, oh, that was cool, but next time don't do it this way, or like, hey, can we do it like this? We've seen a lot of cool stuff from people wanting to volunteer to be able to do stuff on the site now that it's kind of been opened up for this thing. To a really cool thing that we did is we had, during one of the StoryCorps interviews, there was actually a guy who I sat in and did his interview. He raved about his barbecue. I was like getting starving as I was listening to his interview. And so I was like, all right, you talk a good game. Let's see if you can actually do it. And so we hired him to cater one of our events. And somebody else came and said, hey, he cooks a good barbecue, but I cook a better one. And so on another event, we said, we're going to have a barbecue cook-off, which I loved. It was kind of benefited from. And what was really cool is that more people came and said, well, that was good, but I can totally do another one. And so what was interesting is that, and they wanted to come and participate, and so what we're seeing is that people want to come and be part of making this space alive and part of like sharing their things with the community. And so they're constantly coming to us and saying, hey, can we do an event like this? Or can I bring my group to be able to plan something here? And so it's opening up that dialogue. And some of it's to sort of say that as designers, we can use design as a conversation piece. I often talk about this idea of call and response, that we sort of listened to the community, heard some things that they were interested in, physically acted that out, and then allowed them to respond to that and give us their input and make decisions, or even shape the way that the site was being used through their own activation.
So what happens, that sounds really great. What happens when you leave, or do you ever leave? How do you keep in touch? Because I think they really want your input. Let's say they're having some changes and they'd like to kind of figure out what to do. So what is this relationship like?
Yeah, I think, so this project is still ongoing, and I went from having a 1-year contract 3 years ago to still working on it. And I think part of what we're looking at is not only how do we design the physical pieces, but where are the capacity challenges within the organizations that exist in the community, and how part of our mandate can be to build that capacity so that they have an ability. So it's a little bit of like a train the trainers type of thing that we do. And I think even on other projects I have where we're leaving in shorter periods of time, like this is very unusual for me in terms of the length of this particular project. But part of what I always try to do is that part of the brief is looking at the organization that is who is my client. And how do I give them the tools that they can carry forth what's created? Because rarely when you finish a project, in terms of what we constitute as finished, is a project ever finished, to your point. And I think it's about figuring out what are the tools they need beyond the product to actually be able to continue to make changes themselves, to continue this mode of inquiry and experimentation, and be able to shape it. I often describe to my students, I talk about this idea of design, that I think of design not as a period, which I think is the way we're generally trained to think of it, but to think of it more as a comma, that there's stuff that's happened before you got there, and there's stuff that will happen after you leave, and how where you place that comma shapes that future. And so to be really conscious of that as an intentional act, and to figure out what are the things that allow that future to be shaped in a productive way that is emblematic of where you hope the project ultimately goes.
So how do you begin to shift that conversation to design as a comma instead of an exclamation point with a photo, with a, Dick's published photo? I think we're still in that era, but at the same time, I see a lot of interesting things going on in design firms where they know that it's not about, finishing, moving on, and getting on to the next job, but they're beginning to have different contracts, they're going back for adjustments. I mean, this is like design as I always hoped that it could be, and now it's sort of beginning to happen. So how does that shift begin?
So, the thing I said towards the end of my talk about looking at this idea of not analyzing problems, but engaging in human relationships, I think starts at the very beginning of a project. So generally with most of my projects, the front end of it is, this extensive period of interviews and conversations with people who represent those that we want to engage a project with the client. I think, so one of the most interesting experiences that I've had in my career is the fellowship I did with IDEO.org. And so IDEO and IDEO.org, global design and innovation company, kind of pioneered human-centered design or really advances it. And what's really interesting is that when you look at how they scope their projects, within an architecture project, the pre-design research phase is this tiny thing that you barely get paid for, yet has like so much implications for what happens in the project. But there's no room to question whether or not the brief you got from your client is actually the correct thing. There's a very little wiggle room within that. At IDEO and IDEO.org, they've kind of perfected getting paid a lot of money for that piece. That is like the most important piece of a project, because so many of your assumptions for what you do is baked in that moment of research. And so that research is extensive interviews, and not necessarily like huge numbers like a market research thing, but deep qualitative interviews that are like an hour long each with people in their environments to really understand not just the problem, but their entire lives. The problem piece is actually like a third of the interview. Everything else is understanding their life, because you can't really design something that can be a solution or that can have an impact unless you understand the context in which that is fitting in. So for me, what happens is that through having those conversations in the project, I'm able to understand not only from the client, like what really is driving this thing that they want to create, and what is their true pain point and what is their vision point, but I'm also able to understand from the community or the people who will engage in a project, what are they hoping to achieve and what do they desire? And on top of that, are also building relationships of trust. So to go back to the San Francisco example, what's really funny is the client has said to us that they've had to do engagement activities before our project as part of just the due diligence that they have to do as a company operating in this place. But they get like 10, 20 people if they're lucky showing up to the community meetings that they hold. And it took years before people in the community knew any of the members of the company. But like, we operated after 3 months, and every time I'm there, they're like, "Oh my God, it's so good to see you. How are you doing?" And I'm like, "Oh, great. How's your grandbaby?" Like, they trust us to kind of do right by them. And so we can sort of take risk because that relationship has now been built. And so it's really building that foundation where I can expect at the end of it, will still be asked to come into the community or still be asked for questions when they get stuck. And I have lots of clients where this happens now, where the contract is technically done, but we've built such a relationship that continues.
So it's really interesting because the research that has been done until now, from what I see, I mean, every architecture firm says that they're doing research. But really, I mean, when you think about it, when you think about the results, they're not doing research. I don't know what they're doing. But I think one of the things that is really interesting that distinguishes what you're describing from the market research model is that this is about much more connecting the person who's actually going to work with the community on their design, understanding much more than anyone has ever understood about the client, which is really, really interesting because I talk to people who do this. Some people in healthcare design are beginning to do this, And they're saying it's incredibly difficult, but incredibly rewarding because of what they know, the relationships that they have, the solutions that they come up with. So how do we begin to kind of make this more of an accepted method of designing? Because I think the schools need to figure out how to integrate this into their education. Designers need to understand how to do this without complaining about spending too much money on it. So, I mean, what is your advice on this kind of switching from market research to real research?
Oh, that's, complicated question. I mean, when it comes, let's take the schools, for instance, when it comes into there, I think, when I teach and when I look at studio courses, the studios rarely leave space for the brief. And there's a good virtue to having an ability for students to develop their creative voice, and sometimes be removed from distraction to do that. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't incorporate as part of the curriculum studios where you are actually out there engaging the community and not pulling a dick in terms of like, oh, we're going to give this to the community, but actually having an intensive part of the studio process or even seminars that are about this. So I teach a seminar where like essentially my students spend 2 months out in a community and they're supposed to come back and translate the community, and they need to talk to people, which is super scary for a lot of kids, shockingly, and then we're surprised why it's hard for them to figure out how to do that when they get into professional circles. So giving them the opportunity to figure that out in a school environment and then learn how that then translates into their design and helping to begin to build that tool. And I started teaching in part because, for most of my career, I've worked in social impact design, and over the last 10, 15 years, it's something that a lot of students coming out are super interested in. But I'd noticed that like they had amazing passion and zilch for skills. Like they had never been prepped, and so they couldn't translate it, and we were getting a lot of dicks, which, when you see the entire thing, you'll see that Dick is very well-intentioned. It's not that he wants to do wrong by the community. And so I think figuring out a way to start to build those skills of how to talk to people, how to relate to people, and how that can connect to your design and be part of the creative process is super important in the academic world. And then in the professional circles, I think it's, one of the things with the San Francisco project, the first thing we did was to build the StoryCorps booth and start doing that. And we essentially took our community engagement budget and we hijacked it. And we just said, instead of having meetings, could we just do this thing, which would because in the early interviews that we were doing with people one-on-one, we were finding that it was really hard for them to visualize what to put on the site because they had never been able to be on the site because it was a power plant. And so part of this was we were saying, hey, to actually start this conversation and making it a community-based project, we need to figure out ways to bring people on the site. So let us build it. And they said that was great, and we did it, and it was very successful. And so for the first year of event activation, we were literally drawing from that fund. And then when we renewed the contract, because they had seen that evidence of how many people were coming out, how people were feeling when they came out, they created a whole new line item just to support that work. So I think sometimes the setup exists where clients are not necessarily supporting that as part of the design project, but that doesn't mean that you can't look at your budget and figure out hacks. There are lots of ways that you can take little pots of money and expand it, and some of it is then actually being able to provide evidence, because I think it's hard for a lot of people to take risk without seeing a proof of concept. So looking for ways to test out some of these things can be a way to kind of start to edge your clients over to the other side.
So, I mean, it sounds like the projects that you work on have diversity built into them. When you deal with whole communities, it's not going to be just the side of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, but it's going to be everybody within that community. And that in itself is a really interesting exercise in the things that we're talking about today, because it's a built-in need, a built-in interaction, an ability to find resources within those communities naturally, so you're not having to bring in others. So is that like a really great lesson for us to think about, is where do designers put their attention in addition to those high-paying clients, which obviously keep the office going, but then there's stuff that needs to happen on the side?
Yeah, and I mean, I would say as a mandate, it's about people, not categories. Like, I have a couple projects I do for higher paying clients, and the issues that they're dealing with are the same issues when I'm in the underserved community. It's like people are being categorized, and so therefore you're designing to the category and not to the individual people. And so that produces pain, it produces conflict, all of these things. And so to produce these projects that are innovative and can be broadly supported, I think it's about tapping into the humanity, which I think sometimes we set aside in the bid to be as rational and intellectually rigorous as possible. But there can be intellectual rigor in being qualitative and being a human being.
It's about life.
Yeah.
The
and love,
complexity of
to
life.
the point that you said earlier.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we are going to move on to a special guest. I'm so honored that Marge Anderson agreed to be a cameo special guest for us today. And I'm not going to give a big long bio. Most of you know she has had numerous leadership roles at the USGBC. I will let her elaborate on her other interests and achievements and inspire us. And thank you so much for being here.
Where else is there to be right now? You can't see anything when you're 52 anymore, not up close. I'm amazed and really interested, and I don't even, okay. First, Dick and Rick, that is totally the stickiest thing from Greenbuild.
And you can go up there if you want.
I'm okay here, probably, yeah. The stickiest. Whatever happens tomorrow, it doesn't matter. It's not going to top that. And Gabrielle, I've never seen an institutional, organizational level invitation to be loud.
To what?
To be loud. Oh. And I'm like, oh my God, I need some of that. That would be so great. I'll tell you a couple things about me, and I will speak from so we've heard from an organizational and a design level. I'm probably best qualified to speak from an individual level, and that's kind of what I've been thinking about. I'm a working class person and was raised working class, but I have a fancy education. I did go to Mount Holyoke College, which is a women's college in the East. And I didn't realize until I was probably in my 40s that the working class piece was more impactful than I thought it was on how I developed as a person. And as you know, this is the United States. We don't talk about class. And and I also have a wife that has always been less of an issue for me personally, professionally, than being a woman in the workplace. And then I'll just tell you about a thing that happened to me at lunch today. I was at the executive luncheon, which is where we celebrate kind of the capitalist side of the movement at USGBC. Let's leave it at that. Some of you have been to that. It's a good event. It's a good event. It's not my part of the movement, but it's a good event. And I met a male executive there, and we had probably 30 to 60 seconds of conversation. I shared that I'm in the energy and utility industry, and he said, oh, I've been looking to get on a utility board of directors. And we had a great conversation about it. We talked about why that would be important. He's a really cool guy. He's doing amazing stuff. And I sat down and I thought, no woman would ever do that after knowing someone for 60 seconds, right? I mean, the chances of that happening are slim to none. And so what would happen if we stepped into our power? What would happen if we asked for what we actually wanted and what we think about and didn't wait for an invitation? No, we don't always wait for an invitation. We don't always do those things, and we're learning to come out of our shell more and step into our power, but we're still not that good at it. So I thought, dude, I learned something from you guys every day. And tomorrow's the 4th anniversary of our Women in Green Power breakfast, and when I spoke at the first one, I said, WWMD is pretty much my daily ritual that I need for myself to say, what would a man do in this situation? Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean we would always do what a man would do, but it means we have that for a frame of reference, so we have the opportunity to think about more than one way of doing things. So that that's not even what I put down on when I was thinking about coming here today, but I also would like to celebrate that next year's chair of the board is also a woman, and she's a hardcore killer engineer and brilliant and fabulous with an amazing value center, and that's Fiona Cousins. And yay, she's so great. I'll just share at the end of the board of directors year, we have this little roast for everybody that's rolling off the board, and I got roasted this year in the chair position, and two things happened at that roast that really stuck with me. One was one of the male board members said to me that I had a really high emotional intelligence, and I was so excited because he said it as a compliment and not as just like an adder, like glitter, but like, oh, you know, you're good at your job, and oh, by the way, you also have high EQ. It was actually a primary motivator for him in that. And that was important to me. And the other guy, who was about as linear and financial as it gets, which was a great asset on a board of directors in our fiduciary role, was talking about some of the things he'd learned on the board, and he said he'd learned from my style of emotional leadership. And again, it was a plus. My personal style has not often been seen as a plus in the daily paid work world. Usually in volunteer work is great, but it's not always so awesome at work. Maybe we have I won't say if we have the Dick Rick culture in the energy and utility industry, which one we might have at any given time, but so I'll just say that. So I thought emotional leadership, and I thought in this work that we're doing, is there any other way to lead? We heard this morning that partnership is the key to success. When we think about the challenges we have with sustainability, the new skill sets to solve the problems that we have are collaborative and holistic, cooperative, not competitive, not winner take all. They're not Western. A lot of the things that we need in this movement aren't Western. I think about USGBC's ceasefire with the American Chemistry Council, which we never could have won in terms of just pure ammunition. And that idea came from Mahesh Ramanujam because he put an Indian way of thinking to solving the conflict rather than a Washington, let's just fight it out until we get to the bloody end. And now we're in a much better place that way. And, you know, as the world gets smaller and hotter and flatter and more full of conflict, and as climate change exacerbates those problems, this not winner-take-all attitude matters. We heard even this morning from James Cameron that when the group does better than the individual, that's really the path ahead for us. So diversity is, as Perkins and Will clearly knows, and your work at the social equity level is amazing. That's the path for the future. We don't really have any choice, do we? You know, the stakes are really high. So thank you all for everything that you're doing. Thank you so much for what I learned from all of you. Thank you to Kira and Lance for doing the great work that you're doing, and just really glad to be here today.
Thank you. So I actually do have a question for the USGBC. And you can't go. You can't go. So I believe that you're on the right track with this amazing kind of connection of business and creating economic profit and all of that. I'm not debating any of that. What is happening from the outsider as a perception is that you're dumbing down the message in mainstreaming the USGBC. I mean, you know, what's been really interesting to me that you seem to be like every other mainstream organization now, where you bring in people like the Mika and Koki, who are basically non-starters in terms of understanding the business of green building, and they're asking the wrong questions of the people that you put up there that should have been challenged, should have been delved into, should have been giving us a lot more information. So how do you get away from this sort of mindless mainstreaming? I'm sorry to be so gentle.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure at all. So I also should tell you I have a background in event design and management. So I have I think through a couple different lenses at Greenbuild. And certainly an opening general session is a mass audience thing, and it's not very easy to tailor, but clearly there's some emotion around this issue, so I don't think you're an outlier.
You think?
I'll say that tension has always been true here, and maybe the best answer is that diversity itself is the solution. And I think about, so yesterday, for folks who were here yesterday, we had our 3 summits, and all 3 of them were on this floor in these consecutive ballrooms. And during the networking time in the morning, I walked through the 3 of them, and you could really see the divisions of what they were. So the first summit was the international summit. And Rick had said this morning we had 85 countries here. And so the look and feel just was many more people of color than white people, and a lot of dark suits. And there's certainly exceptions in there, but that was that demographic. The second demographic was the materials summit. And so there were a few scientists and a lot of architects, so you saw a lot of architectural glasses. And very white, right? Very, very white. And the third summit, which is my personal favorite because of my activist background, was the Communities and Affordable Housing Summit. Younger, chattier, a lot of boundless energy, many different colors, everything from t-shirts to suits, all over the place. And that was all happening on this floor out in this area here. That, I think, is the future of USGBC. Certainly part of the founding of USGBC was by the significantly large corporations that wanted to have market share in the solutions ahead. So they were doing it for sometimes for the right reasons, and also because they were smart enough to know that things were changing, combined with the design aesthetic. I think our population is going to be completely different in 10 years, and much more expanded. As you think about the other rating systems that have been brought online, they appeal to very different demographics. The EDGE rating system is for developing countries that can't possibly support LEED because they don't have the market infrastructure. So are we there yet? No. And even if I told you we were, you clearly don't think so. And you're really the driving force of change in the movement. So
can I get a promise out of you here?
You can get a promise from me. You bet.
Okay.
In my role, limited role as a volunteer, but I think this is an ethos that's passionate among the staff that are the institutionalized. Being in Washington is weird. That's my personal opinion. It's probably not a politically correct USGBC position. I mean, it's a weird. There's a certain culture of Washington that, but it's just a personal life. So yeah, you have my.
Well, I think the however it all functions and whatever it brings in is fantastic. The more the better, and the more skills the better, the more diversity the better. But I think the core belief that the earth and humanity together and the built environment we create has to be at the front and center, and those who create it and those who collaborate on it have to be the people who push the dialogue further and further and further.
So Susan, who would you recommend as some potential keynotes?
Well, I think first of all, I would have doctored today's keynote by telling Mika what the USGBC does. I mean, give the journalists
wait. Let me restate the question. I'm sorry. For next year, who would you recommend?
I would like a really good, solid journalist, if journalists are important, who actually does the homework and actually says that this is the group that knows X, Y, and Z, that they've been doing it for 20 years. Now they're ready for the next phase. And how do we get to that information so that you challenge them? The room was half empty. I mean, she kept saying 10,000. She didn't check her numbers. I mean, I was in the back of the room. It wasn't 10,000 people. It used to be 10,000. I mean, so you really need that kind of knowledge, that kind of information that says the USGBC is important. It needs to go forward. It needs to evolve into a very powerful organization, then much more powerful than it's ever been, because if we're going to call in business, call in capital, call in all of that, you are going to have to be that.
So I think we should crowdsource how to choose the plenary speakers. Because
crowdsource is a good idea.
I will definitely bring that up. Kimberly Lewis and Kate Hurst are good friends of mine. I will definitely bring it up. We would
it's
get
so
amazing ideas.
It's so many audiences. It is very complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, it's tricky.
But we're talking about skills, and we're talking about commitment, and we're talking about doing your job well. If you're a journalist, you ask questions, and you don't ask 10 questions about, what did you have for lunch? Really. I mean, really. It's like, you really, I'm sorry. No, so I'm just saying the format is not the problem. It's the preparation, it's the connection, it's what they all talked about, it's that research that informs the process that needs to be done here as well as everywhere else.
I think we have a couple of keynote candidates sitting right here.
There you go.
I thought you guys were riveting. And I've not been to sessions here that talked about your specific area. So it was wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And thanks, go now.
And thanks for
keep speaking up.
And thanks for receiving it in a generous mode. Thank you.
We are a movement of love.
With love.
Thank you, Marge.
So there are some questions. And there's a mic there, so you can be recorded. Please come up.
Or I can bring it around to anyone who would like it.
Anyone? Anyone? Yes, come on up and speak into the mic and let us know who you are, because you're on camera.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I got to talk to her. Hi, everyone, including people at home. My name is Gisela Garrett. I work for BKSK Architects, and we're big believers of equity, both in our practice, but also in how we view the success of our projects and our events, and maybe especially because we've already had a self-proclaimed event planner speak. I kind of want to challenge you guys. Like, we're talking about inclusion. How could we make Greenbuild that much more inclusion? How could we make this space right now that much more inclusive going forward? I think if you guys had any ideas, we're clearly a very receptive audience. Thanks.
Well, I just want to add something here. I was watching who was coming into the morning plenary this morning. It was really gratifying to see so many young women being part of that. So it was that part of the inclusion was there for me, because I was looking at shadows and looking at how people dressed and looking at how people moved, and they were very, it's a new generation that's coming, and young men and young women, and I think that's a really very encouraging mode. The diversity in terms of male-female was probably there, but not as much as culture, racial, and all of that. So I think that question, if you guys could answer some of that, how do you get that diversity into the USGBC? Gabrielle? No, do you recommend the exercise that Perkins and Will, or some sort of a working group within the USGBC
Yep, I think it's as I ended my talk, it has to be deliberate. So you have to find a way to reach out to who you want to be here in a very unabashed, out in front way. You could reach out to National Organization of Minority Architects.
Yeah, good.
I think it's also about figuring out why those people aren't here. Like, why are they not coming? Right. And actually having, to your point of the conversations that you had, which bubbled up a lot of stuff that helped you understand, here are the issue areas that we need to address to be able to get to that future that we want to see. So carrying out the same exercise in this space to sort of say, well, we don't understand why they're not here. We have this very open process, and we're open to everyone. That's not enough. That's big dick.
Well, and but it does have something to do, too, with both the plenary and the sessions. I mean, there are a lot of sessions that a lot of people would come to, but if you look at the plenary part, which is sort of the star part, that's like if you open a quick one page, that's whose face you're going to see. Those people are not going to be attracting that audience.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, just say. I mean, the discussion we were just having. That I mean, I didn't even consider going.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Yeah. No. Did somebody say?
Yeah, don't speak there. Speak here.
Wait, what?
Cost. I can't hear you.
Oh, cost prohibitive. Yeah. Like, I mean, well, I think it is, because I think it's like, I mean, I looked at it and I was like, I'm just coming for a session, because it's just not, like the money that it would cost, and I could sort of say, like, if you're saying, hey, we want to get more people from community organizations or even in community-based design or nonprofits, how can they justify paying this much money to come for a couple days for this, for something that when they come, the sessions don't necessarily align with the things that they need to know.
And they have done some things along those lines. I know, like the Women in Green breakfast, which admittedly is held at an ungodly hour, so you have to be willing to tolerate that. But anyone who pays to go to that is sponsoring a young person to come, which is why everyone, even those who are speaking and all that other stuff, pay to go. So more of that is, I think, helpful, and more ways to, and that includes like high school kids and others, which is, you know, ways I think we should expand those kinds of opportunities and make more ways for there to be local inroads where it's partial. Yeah. You can come for a little bit and get a taste of it. Yeah. Just get a little piece of it.
Well, and I think it's also about like figuring out, can there be some intentionality, not just about like, to get to the point of the whole diversity thing of like, hey, do we have that representation in the room? But then also the quality of that participation. Right. So like, to what end are we asking for diversity to be here? Is it just so that we can see kind of a group of diverse faces or faces of difference and then feel better about that? Or is there something that we believe comes as a benefit from diversity? And if that is the case, then making that an intentional part of the programming decisions so that like it
that's
actually...
an outcome piece. Yeah. I think if there were some outcome out of that, that would actually make it more meaningful for the next, then that's a recruitment tool for the next year.
Exactly.
You know,
but what's interesting, because we have experience in designing the room. You can actually design the room with all the stakeholders that you want in there to discuss a certain thing. So, I mean, I think the USGBC sessions have room for that, and have room for bringing in people who are going to deal with this very seriously. It needs to be outcomes oriented. It needs to be a report written on it. So, I mean, there could be some really interesting beginnings of real conversations around this. Within the programming of the USGBC.
Right.
Yes, come up, please.
And then Gabrielle's going to have to go soon. I'm sorry, just to remind you.
So my first thing is just a short comment. I am glad you didn't change the name. I came because it said women, and I am a woman. Second is I am an engineer, and when I went to school, I remembered being the only girl in my class, and now I'm starting to realize that it's getting better and better for the women, but now I realize there were no women of color, and I'm starting to get to that point where I now have some power in my career, and I can hire people into my company. How can I reach out to that population specifically? Thank you.
That's a good question.
Who wants to tackle that? Gabrielle, before you fly away.
Right, then I got to get on a plane. Again, be deliberate. So you can reach out to, it depends on what level they're at, right? You can go to the architecture schools in your area. You can reach out to the HSBCs, Howard and so forth. There's like 7 of them. You can contact the National Organization of Minority Architects, who have a roster of all of their members. So things like that. And advertise. And your brochures, or however you're recruiting, if the brochure doesn't look like me, why would I go there? If there's nobody at the top that looks like me, and this place does, I'm going here.
It is still a huge, that came up in the survey this summer.
It's
so many,
gender,
and it came from
race,
both coasts who said they were actively trying to hire minority, and we're getting 0 applicants. We're actively looking.
That's
I mean,
right.
it was.
So
astounding.
granted, there aren't, I mean, it's a very small percentage of our profession and of the schools, and that's a problem, and that's got to change. So there's not a whole lot of folks sitting around waiting to, but you have to look, and we have to help build the pipeline. That was the whole, the message. So we have to build the pipeline.
Okay, so Gabrielle, get out of here. You need.
Thank you, everybody.
Gotta go.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you so much. Sorry to make you rush.
Madam Susan. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, one last question here. Yes, 2 last questions. Please come up.
I can't go with the mic.
Okay, and face the audience.
My name is Paula Loomis. I'm an architect, and I was just going to share 3 things that happened to me recently that are good things. One was I went to the Region of the Virginia's Architecture Conference a couple weeks ago, and they had a session on work-life balance, and I expected it to be women, and it was presented by all men. And their thoughts were exactly the same ones that we've been talking about, and their life struggles in balancing. At least they recognized the home work-life thing. And I thought that was very positive, and hats off to AIA Virginia, because I think they specifically asked men to come and talk about it, which is great. And then I work for the Coast Guard, and I'm in charge of the facilities worldwide for them, which is a first for them to have a woman in that position, which is really good. Yes. And the gentlemen who work right immediately beneath me, who have spent 30 years in their careers, came up and asked me to do a women's survey to look at our women and home life balance, and if they were leaving, why they were leaving. Mm-hmm. So hats off to them.
Nice. Thank you.
A live one.
Hello.
And he's good looking too.
Hi, I'm Randy Pfizer. I'm the CEO for the American Society of Interior Designers. I've actually worked in the diversity field my entire career before getting to become the CEO of ASID. But one of the things I would challenge this group in our conversations that we've had, so I have the flip side of the problem. 80% of interior designers are women. So this conversation has been about where are the women. Well, a lot of them are in interior design, and they're in sustainability. And I know the voices of this organization in the foundation of USGBC was incredibly important, and LEAD CI was created because of the voice of women and the need to bring interiors into the sustainability conversation. But I think USGBC, as it developed, also started going to building performance as being what sustainability meant. And that then started blocking out the interior designers from the conversation and the women from the conversation who were in that part of the profession. As we see wellness coming back into the conversation and materiality coming into the conversation, you're beginning to see more women stepping back into the fold, and the leadership of those women coming back into the conversation. But they've been here in the Healthy Building Network and others. Now, we have a diversity issue within interior design, but that is also changing. If you look at the schools and the universities, a lot of the classes similar to architecture are very diverse. But giving them the pipeline and the opportunity when they get out of school and into their careers is going to be very different. And making sure those firms, as you said, represent at the top of the leadership what it is that they're bringing in and the emerging pipeline that's being brought to them on a very real basis. But I challenge the conversation a lot of times when we use the term only architecture and engineering to define this community, which is full of designers who are in lots of different professions that impact the work that we're talking about here.
Absolutely.
So,
thank you. That was a really important point to make.
Excellent point.
Kira, would you like to wind down?
Well, sure. And I mean, I would actually add on to that. I mean, I think certainly it's a much broader thing. I mean, the construction field and the influence of construction and the way that construction has changed in terms of its dominance of the AEC field generally in the last 10 or 15 years, and its male dominance, that alone is a whole separate diversity question. So I do think there are lots of pieces there to address. I think we've started a lot, and you brought up so many things because so many pieces of the mainstreaming, certainly interiors being dominated by women in many cases, was part of sustainability moving as fast as it did during a certain period of time, and that was so important. And the voices of those people in our book were absolutely critical. I could name dozens and appreciate their contributions. Sorry. But I think that, I guess I would say that we started several pieces of conversations here. I wish I could sum up a way to figure out how to continue them. Because every time we leave one of these, I feel like we've picked a thread. There's like three threads here threads. And a couple over here, and well, Micah's a whole other issue. We'll deal with her later. But I really appreciate you coming, and I do think this is an important topic for the whole industry. And I think it's even though we're going to continue to use women in the title, and thank you for still coming when we do. It is really a much bigger thing, and I particularly appreciate the distinction between equity and equality. That I think maybe is probably the biggest takeaway. Because if anything defines like what we're trying to do, it's that. I mean, equality is just, okay, let's be fair. Equity is something entirely different and much bigger. So
that's a great way to end, and so that's something to build on.
Thank you so much, Susan.